A dark past in the suburbs. Melissa's earliest memories were shaped by the quiet streets and open fields of a small Midwestern town. A place that, to outsiders, seemed safe and ordinary. But inside the modest house at the end of Maple Drive, her world was nothing like the gentle landscape outside. Her mother, once vibrant and full of laughter, had become withdrawn after remarrying a local man whom everyone regarded as respectable and kind. Behind closed doors, however, this man transformed into someone cruel and controlling. For Melissa, childhood meant navigating a home filled with fear. Every footstep in the hallway could turn into a nightmare. As a child, Melissa sought comfort from her mother, but the woman's silence was more suffocating than the threats themselves. Whenever Melissa tried to share what was happening, hoping for a mother's protection, she was met only with cold avoidance and indifference. The whispered warnings and pleading glances were ignored. Left alone, she learned to shrink herself inward, becoming invisible in hopes of avoiding attention. At school, Melissa tried to blend in with the other kids, hiding the bruises, both seen and unseen. Behind practiced smiles and layers of clothing, teachers, neighbors, even close friends failed to see past the surface. Sometimes she wondered if perhaps she really was as unworthy and powerless as her stepfather made her feel. The isolation and shame became a constant shadow, shaping the way she saw herself and the world around her. Every day at home was a careful performance. Silence became Melissa's shield. She moved around the house with quiet precision, instinctively sensing when danger was near. She counted the years, the days, until she could escape this prison disguised as a family. Deep down, a quiet fury began to burn, a promise to herself that one day none of them would ever have power over her again. Escape to survive. On the night of her 18th birthday, Melissa made the decision that would forever change her life. With nothing more than a weathered backpack, a handful of cash she'd quietly saved over the years, and a heart heavy with fear and hope, she slipped quietly out of her childhood home, careful not to wake anyone. Each step down the driveway felt both perilous and liberating, a silent goodbye to the suffocating walls that had held her captive for so long. The bus ride out of town was a journey into the unknown. Staring out the window as the gentle rise and fall of cornfields gave way to highways in bustling cities, Melissa felt a swirl of anxiety and anticipation in her chest. She had chosen New York, a city as overwhelming as it was promising. She knew no one there, had no job lined up, and nowhere to stay. But for the first time, the future was hers to shape. Survival, even with all its uncertainty, felt like a form of freedom. Life in New York was anything but easy. Melissa quickly learned that the city did not pause for anyone, least of all, a runaway with a tangled past and limited means. She spent her first nights in all-night diners, huddled in the corner, nursing a single cup of coffee, and sometimes in anonymous shelters where strangers came and went without a word. Every morning, she woke up determined to find work and make ends meet. She took any job she could get, waiting tables, cleaning apartments, running errands for people who barely glanced in her direction. Each dollar she earned was a small victory, a testament to her determination not to be trapped or defined by her past. Loneliness was an almost constant companion. Though surrounded by millions, Melissa often felt invisible. There were nights when memories of home threatened to drag her into despair, and days when the exhaustion of balancing work and simply surviving felt overwhelming. But with every challenge, she grew tougher and more resourceful. The city taught her how to trust selectively, how to navigate bureaucracies, and how to protect herself in an environment that could seem as harsh as the one she had left behind. Yet, in the anonymity of New York, Melissa also began, bit by bit, to regain a sense of self she thought she had lost. The city's diversity gave her space to disappear, but also to experiment, to figure out who she wanted to become. Watching the ambition and hustle of those around her, she let herself imagine a future where safety, stability, and even success were more than just distant fantasies. Each small step, openly smiling at a customer, negotiating for better pay, talking to a coworker about dreams beyond survival, was a declaration that she was alive, and her story wasn't finished yet. Achieving success and power. Melissa's first years in New York City were spent in survival mode, but even as she scraped by, she always carried within her a stubborn ember of ambition. That determination, forged during years of silent suffering, would become the foundation for everything that came after. At 20, after countless jobs and endless nights, Melissa landed an entry-level receptionist position at a small public relations firm in Brooklyn. It was far from glamorous, but to her, it felt like stepping onto solid ground for the first time. She arrived 15 minutes early every day, watched and listened more than she spoke, and absorbed the rhythms of the office. The urgency with which phone calls were answered, the precision in every press release and pitch. Most of her colleagues seemed preoccupied, floating through their workdays in small talk. Melissa, meanwhile, saw the PR business as a living organism, one that thrived on perception, narrative, and influence. She noticed details everyone else missed. The way executives' moods shifted after receiving news from key clients. Which stories made a splash and why? Who earned the most respect in the conference rooms? And how sometimes just the right phrase, uttered at the right moment in a meeting, could subtly shift the course of a campaign. Relentless dedication. She refused to let herself be overlooked. In the evenings, while others went out for drinks or disappeared into the city's nightlife, Melissa stayed behind, offering to proofread releases, update contact lists, organize the supply room, and help the office manager troubleshoot the ever-glitchy phone system. She made herself indispensable, not by pushing herself forward, but by making sure every detail was perfect. It wasn't long before her work ethic was noticed. The firm's founder, a tough woman named Harriet Shields, tapped Melissa to support her on a crisis project. A high-profile executive embroiled in a media scandal. Melissa worked through the night, drafting responses, coordinating schedules, and compiling background research. At 3 a.m., harried and exhausted, Harriet turned to her and said, "You've got the kind of tenacity we need around here." It was the first genuine praise Melissa could remember receiving in years. First breakthroughs. After that, opportunities came more quickly. Melissa moved to an assistant account manager role, supporting clients in industries ranging from tech startups to nonprofits. She found she had a gift for tuning into a client's needs, sometimes understanding what they truly wanted before they could articulate it themselves. Melissa found being an outsider, having always observed from the periphery, gave her a unique vantage point. She saw relationships as webs, darting between stakeholders, hidden power players, reporters, and even the intern who sometimes let slip a valuable rumor. Bit by bit, she built a small network, a handful of sympathetic journalists, ambitious professionals, and kindred spirits she met in late-night diners and networking events. She learned to be shrewd, but never ruthless. She didn't want to become like those who had hurt her. She sought out mentors, a reserved, brilliant copywriter who taught her the power of language, a gregarious former anchor who schooled her in media psychology, and later on, a pioneering tech entrepreneur, one of the few women founders Melissa met, who showed her how to demand seats at tables that were never designed for people like her, turning setbacks into stepping stones. It wasn't all steady progress. As a young woman in a fiercely competitive business, she faced belittlement, inappropriate advances, and, once, a strategic backstabbing from a jealous manager who stole her proposal for a major campaign. The betrayal stung. For a few days, Melissa considered giving up, but the same fire that pushed her out of her childhood home burned ever hotter when she was challenged. Instead of confronting her rival and risking retaliation, she meticulously documented all her contributions. When the firm was audited after a client lodged a complaint about the campaign's false promises, Melissa's careful records protected her reputation. Management took notice of her integrity, and the manager was quietly reassigned. From then on, Melissa understood that success didn't just come from talent or even hard work. It came from vigilance, documentation, and a willingness to navigate the complicated moral landscape of corporate America, creating her own opportunity. By 26, Melissa had outgrown her role and sought greater challenges. She joined a larger PR agency, one that specialized in high-stakes crisis management for major corporations and celebrities. Here, every move was scrutinized, and the stakes were exponentially higher. Melissa started at the bottom again, but now she moved with a quiet confidence, wielding poise and insight like armor. Her defining moment came during a citywide transit strike that left millions stranded and sparked a wave of negative press for the transportation union, the firm's newest client. Most team members were paralyzed by the torrent of criticism. Melissa listened carefully in meetings, noting that union leadership insisted their workers were being demonized. She proposed a bold campaign, showcasing the stories of bus drivers, subway operators, and maintenance workers, moments of heroism, community, and hardship the public never saw. She worked day and night, producing short videos, brokering exclusive interviews, and inviting the press to ride along on a grueling overnight shift with a mother of 3 who kept a subway station spotless. The campaign didn't reverse all the striking's ill will, but it fundamentally shifted the conversation from anger to empathy. The client's president publicly credited the firm, and Melissa's direct supervisor privately revealed she had gotten the idea from a kid who knows how to see people, not just headlines. Day by day, building an empire. Aiming from crisis management, Melissa pivoted into digital marketing just as social media exploded, recognizing early on the massive influence of online communities. She began freelancing on the side, helping small businesses and ambitious influencers shape their stories. She partnered with a friend from a networking event to build a boutique agency that promised candid, rigorous advocacy for underrepresented founders, women-led startups, and grassroots nonprofits struggling to break through the noise. Under Melissa's leadership, the agency grew from 3 people in a cramped, shared office to a team of 40, occupying an airy suite in Manhattan's Flatiron District. Her negotiating tactics became legendary, calm, relentless, able to find consensus in the most fractious rooms. She mentored junior employees, remembering the loneliness of her own journey in trying to give others what she hadn't had: guidance, respect, and a sense that their voices mattered. A new kind of power, wealth and recognition followed. By her early 30s, Melissa had been profiled in national business magazines, invited to speak at industry conferences, and even consulted by city officials on public engagement strategy. She bought a brownstone in Brooklyn, decorated it with art by local creators, and filled her schedule with meetings, press events, and strategy sessions that stretched long into the evening. Yet Melissa's ambition was different than most. Power, to her, was never about crushing rivals or climbing over others. It was about establishing safety, first for herself, then for anyone whose voice was ignored or story was misrepresented. She was discreet about her own past, but she championed staff and clients who faced discrimination or abuse, quietly funding an employee assistance program and donating generously to organizations supporting survivors of domestic violence. The media world buzzed about how the girl from nowhere had built influence without family connections, old money backers, or the cynicism that defined so much of the industry. To Melissa, each accomplishment was more than achievement or vindication. It was part of a personal promise to never be powerless again and to show by example that pain could be transmuted into agency. A quiet but fierce legacy. Despite her outward composure, Melissa was always moving, planning, preparing. She understood that in the ever-shifting landscape of news and perception, power was fleeting unless it was rigorously defended. She nurtured allies in every sector: media, tech, politics, never forgetting a favor and never failing to show up when an old friend or colleague was in trouble. All the while, she kept her family history a secret, reluctant to revisit the wounds that had shaped her. To those around her, Melissa was a force of nature, creative, determined, impossible to intimidate. They didn't know the source of her resilience, that every triumph was another stone laid atop a foundation built from pain, persistence, and an unwavering refusal to let the past define her. For Melissa, success was more than status or fortune. It was the lifeline she had fashioned for herself, proof that with determination, one could not only survive, but thrive. In the city's bright lights, far from the shadows of her childhood, she finally stood tall, no longer invisible, but unstoppable. The call of home and old wounds. It was late autumn in Manhattan, the city veiled in chilled rain and golden leaves, when Melissa's phone rang, an unfamiliar number from her hometown, blinking on the screen.
Thank you so much.
She hesitated, a knot forming in her stomach. Years had gone by since she'd felt any kind of tie to the place she once called home. Yet some part of her, the fragment of a girl still living at the end of Maple Drive, picked up the call. It was a hospital receptionist, her voice coldly efficient. Melissa's mother had passed away. The funeral would be that weekend, in the same church her mother once dragged her to every Sunday. The news sent shockwaves through Melissa's carefully constructed life. The brownstone she had filled with mementos of her hard-earned success suddenly felt empty, each magazine feature on the bookshelf a little hollow. She had spent years taming the memories of her childhood, fooling herself into believing that they no longer had power over her. Yet now, as she sat alone in her kitchen, the past she thought she had outpaced crashed around her with ferocious force. Days leading up to the funeral were a blur of logistics: booking last-minute tickets, rescheduling client meetings, assigning her deputy temporary control of the agency. Each email wound tighter her anxiety. She packed minimally and flew coach back to the Midwest, wanting as little of the past as possible to adhere to her. The town hadn't changed much. The streets seemed even quieter, houses lined with identical lawns and faded flags. Her Uber driver made polite conversation about local businesses, and Melissa listened, folding herself inward, heart pounding, with a cocktail of dread and resentment. Driving through, she noticed the places where she used to hide with friends, the dimly lit gas station where she first dreamed of leaving. the small park where her mother once pushed her
You're
on the
doing great,
swings,
Emily.
long before everything had changed. She stayed in a small motel at the edge of town rather than her childhood home, unable to face those walls saturated with trauma. That night, unable to sleep, she stared out into the empty parking lot. The ache in her chest was more than grief. It was the mingling of mourning for her mother with the decades-old hurt that her mother never protected her, never even believed her when it really mattered. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and damp. Melissa dressed carefully, choosing a dark navy suit that gave her comfort and strength, and pinned her hair back. She scanned herself in the mirror, searching for any sign of the frightened girl she once was, and finding only the determined woman she'd become. Walking into the church was like wading through quicksand, each step threatening to pull her under. The pews were filled with familiar faces, many marked by time, but untouched by the knowledge of what happened behind closed doors. Her relatives nodded, some offering brittle smiles and awkward hugs. Old neighbors fawned over her return, remarking on her success in New York, always stopping short of asking why she had truly left all those years ago. During the service, Melissa's mind drifted back to childhood Sunday mornings, her mother's gentle hand guiding her into place, her own nervous fingers tracing the wood grain in the pews, her stepfather's presence looming in the aisle across the way. She forced herself to be present, to listen to the eulogies that glossed over her mother's flaws, painting a picture of a dutiful wife and a loving parent. It felt like someone else's story. When it was time for Melissa to give her own tribute, she stood up, heart racing, and approached the altar. She spoke softly but firmly, recalling small kindnesses, her mother's stories about the world outside their town, the song she used to hum when doing chores. But she could not bring herself to mention forgiveness or closure. Instead, she let her words be brief, dignified, refusing to feed the myth of a perfect family. After the service, everyone gathered in the church basement for weak coffee and store-bought cookies. The old social rituals of her hometown quickly reasserted themselves. Polite questions, whispered gossip, little pockets of laughter. It was there that Melissa saw him, her stepfather. His hair had thinned, and his gait was slower, but he carried himself with the same air of respectability that had always blinded others to his true nature. The townspeople surrounded him, offering condolences, praising his devotion as a husband and caregiver, speaking of him as a pillar of the community. Melissa felt as though she'd stepped into a nightmare she'd never really escaped. The urge to scream, to run, to expose the truth consumed her, but she simply watched for a long moment, steadying herself, letting the fury simmer beneath her outward calm. She moved through the crowd, exchanging polite words with people she hadn't seen in years. Some asked about her glamorous life, her career, her time in the Big Apple. None mentioned her long absence. None seemed to wonder aloud about the secrets her family had hidden. Returning to the motel that night, Melissa sat hunched at the edge of her bed, trying to process the raw swirl of anger and sadness inside her. The symbolic door to her childhood had been slammed shut on her years before. Yet now she stood upon its threshold again, forced by circumstance to witness how community memory could sanctify even those who had done great harm. She paced her small room, combing through years of therapy and hard-won wisdom, wondering if any of it could arm her for what lay ahead. She wanted justice, to strip away the mask her stepfather so easily wore, to claim her own story after a lifetime of being forced into silence. Yet she also mourned for what could never be repaired, a family that could never be whole, a mother who could not be reclaimed, a childhood forever tainted. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by visions of the old house, the echo of slammed doors, her mother's face turned away. In the morning, she went for a walk past Maple Drive. The house sat silent, blinds drawn. It looked so deceptively normal, just another home on a block where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. Melissa stood on the sidewalk for a long time, breathing in the cold, damp air. She felt the weight of all she had accomplished: a wildly successful career, power, respect, her own self-worth rebuilt from ruins, still paling in the face of these memories. Yet she also sensed a new resolve forming. She had come back as a different person, one who had found her voice in a world determined to silence her. No matter how badly her hometown wished to preserve its comfortable illusions, she knew the truth, and for once, she felt ready to confront it. The call of home was never just about returning to a place. It was about facing everything she had spent a lifetime outrunning. And now, with her mother gone and the wounds of her past reopened, Melissa knew that this return was not an ending, but the beginning of a reckoning. She would never again allow herself, or anyone like her, to be invisible. Not here, not anywhere. The stepfather, honored. The funeral reception was held in the basement of St. Mary's Church, a space Melissa remembered from her childhood. The same linoleum floors, the same folding tables covered in faded cloths, the air buzzing with low conversation and the clink of coffee cups. The chatter rose and fell like a tide, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the bustle of community volunteers circulating plates of cookies and cut fruit. But the mood shifted almost palpably when Melissa's stepfather entered the room. Walter Fairchild was a master of performance and timing. The years had aged him, his shoulders stooped, his hair was thinner and grayer than Melissa remembered, but he moved with deliberate care, as though bracing the entire weight of the church on his back. Today, in his ill-fitting black suit and starched white shirt, he looked every bit the grieving widower. His blue eyes, watery but bright, scanned the room, searching for familiar faces, receptive smiles, comforting hands to shake or embrace. He was quickly surrounded. Neighbors, parishioners, members of the Rotary Club, and even Melissa's former teachers formed a loose semicircle around him. Lips pursed in sympathy, hands reached out to clasp his own. "Walter, I am so sorry for your loss. Your wife was a saint. Walter, how will you manage now, all alone? Walter, if you need anything at all, we're here." Melissa watched the parade, standing off to one side, half hidden behind a group of younger cousins, whispering about college applications. She tried to keep her face impassive. Inside, she warred with the bitterness and disbelief, mounting with every new eulogy to the man she knew too well. As people offered condolences, they did more than comfort Walter. They honored him. The pastor's wife said he was an exemplar of strength, a devoted caregiver who'd loved his wife until her final days. The principal of the local high school commended Walter for raising a daughter with the values of perseverance and resilience. Others credited him for volunteering at the food pantry, for helping build the community playground, for being the first to shovel neighbors' driveways after a bad snowstorm. Their praise had the effect of a benediction, elevating his reputation from respected to almost saintly. Melissa's head spun. She overheard one woman say, "Walter's been through so much. First his business troubles, now this. Some people are just tested more than others, but he always comes out stronger." Another confided, He raised Melissa well. She's made quite a name for herself in New York. You must be so proud. Walter nodded gravely to each remark, humbly brushing off attention, sometimes dabbing a handkerchief to his eyes, his whole presence radiating modest grief. For Melissa, it was like watching a beautifully staged play in which the villain had charmed the scriptwriter. No one else seemed to notice the chill in Walter's posture, the fleeting glances he sent her way, the way he avoided ever being alone in the same room as his stepdaughter for too long. Their history, her memories, had no place here amongst the neatly folded napkins and warm sympathy. A few guests tried to include Melissa, lightly tugging her into conversations with Walter. "Aren't you glad to be back? You must be so grateful for the upbringing you had. Your mother and Walter both loved you so." Each new, well-intentioned remark felt like sandpaper against old wounds. Melissa wanted to scream the truth, that this man was never a protector, but a predator, that he built his image on secrets and lies, that there were corners of her life left forever in shadow because of his actions. But she simply clenched her jaw, her fingernails pressing into her palm. Her therapist's mantra echoed in her mind. Not every battle has to happen out loud, but the truth is still the truth. People swapped stories about Walter's generosity, how he'd given up weekends to coach Little League, organized fundraisers for the library, or helped someone's grandfather after a heart attack. Once, Melissa might have doubted her own reality in the face of such universal admiration. But now, as she listened and watched, she saw it for what it was, the mask of abusers everywhere, plausible, practiced, almost watertight. As the afternoon wore on, Melissa was called upon to stand for pictures, one formal, with Walter in front of a makeshift memorial table adorned with lilies and framed snapshots of her mother. Walter folded her into a sideways embrace, his hand gripping her shoulder just a little too tightly for comfort. The photographer, a cousin who'd taken up amateur portraiture, instructed them to smile. Melissa's smile was brittle, her body rigid. She caught her reflection in a glass-paned door as the flash went off. She barely recognized the woman staring back, expensively dressed, porcelain composed, but burning inside with a wildfire of rage and sorrow. The platitudes, the praise, the community's determined ignorance all left Melissa feeling increasingly isolated. It was one thing to carry her trauma in silence. It was another to watch her abuser celebrated, to hear her story overwritten by the warm fiction of small-town memory. The sense of unfairness and urgency drummed at her skull. If any justice were to be had, she knew it would not come from within these church basement walls. As the crowd thinned, Walter stood alone, shaking a final hand, his mask still firmly in place. Melissa lingered, watching him, her mind racing through every painful fragment, every stolen piece of childhood, every time her mother had looked away and Walter had gotten away with it. Without anyone else noticing, their eyes met, a flash of recognition, of tension, of threats unspoken. For a moment, everything else dropped away, and it was just the two of them, survivor and oppressor, truth and facade. Later, long after the last guest had left, and the basement was being tidied up, Melissa stepped outside into the fading daylight.
Take it.
She let the chill of the Midwestern evening settle over her. The church bell tolled in the distance, and she realized that, despite the community's blind reverence, she held something Walter could never claim. She remembered the truth, and, with the life, influence, and resources she'd earned, she was prepared, at last, to bring that truth forward, no matter how beloved Walter was by everyone else. What haunted her most wasn't Walter's public adoration or his manipulative grief, but the thought of others, children, spouses, neighbors, trapped by the same performance, afraid or unable to speak. She understood, with clarity that cut through the fatigue and heartache, this farce could not continue. The time for silence was over. The honors bestowed upon her stepfather might have fooled an entire town, but Melissa was determined that for once, the truth would finally break through, confronting and exposing the truth. Melissa stood by the motel window as dawn painted soft pink streaks over the silent town. Sleep had been elusive, her mind spinning with the images of polite faces, hollow condolences, and her stepfather at the center of it all, idolized, unquestioned. The time for silence was done. She looked at her reflection and for the first time saw not only the woman she had become, but the survivor, the fighter she had always been. She began with her story, not the sanitized, made it in New York version the town preferred, but the harrowing truth she had contained for decades. She opened her laptop and started typing. Every memory, every incident she could recall with clarity was recorded in meticulous detail. She listed dates and times, cross-referencing memories with school calendars, birthdays, and news clippings. The therapist who had helped her process her trauma had taught her the importance of documentation, and now her diligence became armor. The next hurdle was finding others willing to speak. As she combed through old class photos and yearbook pages, she remembered whispered rumors about other girls, odd absences, awkward glances, unexplained fears. With a pounding heart, Melissa reached out. She combed social media, tracked down classmates, and cautiously crafted private messages. I know this might seem out of the blue, but I'm revisiting some memories from home, and I wondered if you ever felt unsafe around Walter. The responses dripped in. Some ignored her or gave polite refusals, but then, late at night, her phone buzzed. Empowered by this confirmation, Melissa connected with others, some too afraid to go public, but willing to provide anonymous statements. Each account was a puzzle piece, abuse that spanned years, threats and manipulation, and a community that refused to see what was in front of them. Melissa realized that to truly expose the truth, she had to wield both her pain and her newfound influence. She called on the media contacts she'd cultivated as a PR powerhouse. These were professionals used to tough stories and delicate negotiations. Melissa scheduled confidential meetings with 2 investigative journalists she trusted implicitly from past collaborations, people known not to sensationalize, but to seek the truth, no matter where it led. They met in a quiet city cafe, far from prying hometown eyes. Melissa presented her case, timelines, witness statements, documented inconsistencies in Walter's public good deeds, and the system of complicity that had allowed the abuse to remain hidden. The journalists listened, taking careful notes, asking pointed but gentle questions. She demanded, above all, that the truth be handled with care and dignity, that the voices of survivors not be lost in a rush for headlines. With the journalists' guidance, Melissa reached out to the local police, accompanied by the records she had built and bolstered by the statements of witnesses. She braced herself for indifference or skepticism. After all, these were institutions that had failed her once before. To her relief, the new police chief, a woman who had grown up a few towns over and had made her reputation on thoroughness and empathy, took her claims seriously.
What was it?
Together with the investigative reporters and law enforcement, they began to piece together a timeline, not just of individual abuse, but of a pattern, a network of silenced children, parents who turned away, and social circles that closed ranks to protect their own. Melissa's former therapist validated the gravity of her testimony. She even convinced a teacher, now retired, to recall suspicious injuries and changes in Melissa's behavior. Small signs that in hindsight acquired new and chilling significance. The process was grueling. Every interview, every trip to the sheriff's office, reopened old wounds. There were moments where Melissa felt raw, exhausted, nearly paralyzed by waves of self-doubt. But the memory of Walter being celebrated, of his hand, falsely gentle during photographs, gripping her shoulder, pushed her forward, not just for herself, but for every survivor whose voice had been dismissed or distorted. The investigation went deeper. The journalists discovered grant monies that had been misappropriated by Walter during his tenure as a community volunteer. They found that he systematically positioned himself close to vulnerable families, offering help, ingratiating himself, then wielding power in private. When the story broke, it was not with the tabloid sensationalism Melissa had feared, but with heartbreaking clarity and a call for accountability. Local and regional newspapers published the accounts of survivors, some by name, others protected by anonymity. The articles were damning, not only for Walter, but for a town whose silence had been complicity. Melissa's own story was at the forefront, not as a tale of fall from grace, but of relentless courage and painstaking persistence. There were, understandably, deep divisions in the community. Some clung fiercely to their image of Walter, branding the stories as lies, smears, or delusions. But others, especially a younger generation, rallied around Melissa and the other survivors, calling for reforms, educational programs, and support services for those at risk. For Walter, the house of cards toppled quickly. The police reopened old accusations, and witnesses emboldened by the wave of truth stepped forward. Community fundraisers that had once been celebrated now became the subject of scrutiny. Donations and support dried up. His carefully maintained mask, built over decades, was peeled away to expose the reality beneath. Melissa remained composed through it all. She attended town meetings, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by allies, and spoke whenever necessary. She advocated not just for punishment, but for healing, therapy funds for survivors, outreach to families, candid discussion in schools. Her leadership was practical, but uncompromising. She insisted that every survivor deserved to be heard and respected, no matter how long it had taken for the truth to surface. National media picked up the story, not only for the tragedy it revealed, but as an emblem of reckoning. How small towns protect their own. How nice men use their reputations as shields. How women, especially women who have forged power from brokenness, can force the world to look at what it wanted to ignore. For Melissa, there were TV interviews, panel discussions, invitations to speak with advocacy organizations. She turned down most offers, except those that focused on systemic change rather than personal drama. Through the ordeal, Melissa found healing, not in vengeance, but in the act of refusing to hide. Her life in New York had given her distance, perspective, and a network of support she leaned on heavily. In private, she wept for the girl she'd been, and for the mother who had never found the strength to protect her. In public, she pressed for change, determined that the truth would mark the end of silence for her hometown, and perhaps begin the process of real accountability. In the end, Melissa stood on the steps of the courthouse, facing a small crowd of reporters and neighbors, some supportive, some still in denial. She spoke clearly, her voice unwavering. The truth does not change because it is ignored. The truth is not erased by community rituals or pretty eulogies. For too long, we were told to stay silent, to protect appearances, to bear our pain alone. Not anymore. The time for silence is over. And with that, she walked forward, her head high, her story finally her own, and with the knowledge that the darkness she had endured would, at last, be brought into the light. The journey of healing and revenge through success. Melissa's return to New York after the ordeal in her hometown felt strangely serene, an ending of one chapter and the quiet dawn of another. The city's frenetic pulse seemed, for the first time, less overwhelming and more like a familiar heartbeat. The public unveiling of her stepfather's true nature had both upended her origins and liberated her from a lifelong captivity of silence. She stood at a crossroads, carrying not just the scars of the past, but a new sense of direction, the need to transform her survival, her pain, and even her rage into something larger, a legacy of purpose and restoration. In the weeks following her public disclosures, Melissa faced a tumultuous wave of emotion. There was relief, certainly, a lifting of a weight she hadn't realized she'd still been carrying. But the process of healing was not immediate, nor was it linear. The demands of work, the scrutiny of media, and the ongoing needs of those who reached out to her for guidance threatened to eclipse her own journey. Nightmares did not vanish overnight, and even triumph could sometimes feel hollow when haunted by memories of loss and betrayal. Melissa refused, however, to be defined by her trauma. Therapy remained a cornerstone of her life, safe space where she could unravel the tangled threads of memory, anger, sadness, and, gradually, acceptance. Her therapist guided her through the complexities of confronting a community's complicity, illuminating the difference between justice and revenge. Healing, she learned, was not a finish line, but a lifelong, daily practice, a kind of internal reclamation, a way to build something beautiful upon broken ground. She allowed herself, for the first time in years, to breathe. She explored the city anew, sometimes losing herself in art museums or long walks in Prospect Park. Other times, simply sitting in her kitchen with a mug of tea and letting herself feel, without judgment, the ache and the possibility in her own heart. When the nightmares came, she faced them not with denial, but with the deep knowledge that she was no longer trapped. The city's relentless energy mirrored her own resilience. But what surprised Melissa most was how her success itself became a vehicle for both revenge and healing, a complex, paradoxical reward. The wealth, respect, and influence she had built were no longer simply shields or markers of having made it. They were signposts along a journey she could now fully claim. In the business world, she had already been recognized as a force, a CEO, a strategic sage, a mentor to many. Now, those roles took on richer meaning. Rather than leveraging her power only for her own benefit, Melissa became an even more vigorous champion for others who had been silenced or marginalized. She created an internal advocacy arm within her agency, offering pro bono PR and crisis counsel to survivors of domestic violence, whistleblowers, and those facing systemic injustice. She formalized partnerships with city nonprofits, providing media training and storytelling assistance to those whose voices were too often ignored by mainstream narratives. The transformation was most evident in her approach to mentorship. Melissa opened her agency's doors to interns from disadvantaged backgrounds, young women and LGBTQ youth escaping trauma of their own, refugees starting over, individuals often overlooked by the glossy firms of Manhattan. she instituted trauma-informed training, mental health benefits, and peer support circles. Her leadership was unyielding, but laced with genuine empathy. "No one here walks through the fire alone," she would say. Her commitment stretched beyond policy into her day-to-day life. As she told her story at panels, corporate retreats, and advocacy summits, she refused to sensationalize her pain for applause. Instead, she focused on agency, highlighting how survivors could redefine the story others tried to write for them. She shared tools for documentation, resilience strategies, and step-by-step advice for those seeking to step out of the shadows. For every thank you she received, Melissa redirected credit, insisting that collective action, not any one person's courage, was the only way to spark real change. Despite frequent invitations for television interviews and profile pieces, Melissa guarded her personal boundaries fiercely. She was determined not to be reduced to a symbol or a spectacle. Revenge for her was not about public humiliation of her abuser. It was about succeeding, thriving, loving, and ultimately eclipsing the limitations cruelty had sought to impose on her. Her best response to the years her stepfather had stolen was to live visibly, alive, assertive, and unbowed. In this new stage, the search for healing prompted Melissa to reconnect gently with her roots. She established an annual scholarship in her mother's name at the local community college, earmarked for students overcoming adversity. Quietly, she funded programs for trauma counseling and youth safety in her former hometown, never attaching her name to the donations. Through these acts, she began to thread together the fragments of her childhood, not erasing the damage, but overlaying it with new purpose and hope. Her personal space, too, became a reflection of her journey. Melissa's Brooklyn brownstone bloomed with warmth and creativity. Walls adorned with contemporary local art, shelves lined with volumes on healing and empowerment, the kitchen always stocked for impromptu gatherings with friends and colleagues. She nurtured relationships that had once seemed impossible, honest, mutual, supportive. Love, for Melissa, was now something she allowed herself to receive, as well as to give. Looking inward, she accepted that some wounds would never fully close. There would always be grief for a mother who never found the will or the words to protect her, for a community that looked away, for the innocence lost in the corridors of a house that should have been a sanctuary. Yet Melissa also recognized that every act of kindness, every contract won on her own terms, every life she touched was another stone laid in the foundation of her freedom. In time, the contours of revenge softened into something more enduring. Success, real and hard-won, was not an end in itself, but a platform, a vantage point from which Melissa could lift others as she had once lifted herself. The truest healing sprang from purpose, making certain that even in a world of stubborn darkness, she could be a beacon for those still stumbling toward the light. On the 10th anniversary of her agency's founding, Melissa stood before her staff in their sunlit conference room, her voice steady but suffused with gratitude. "This journey was never just mine," she said. "It belongs to everyone who refused to be written off, everyone who chose to turn pain into action. Our stories may begin in survival, but together, we are forging something that cannot be taken: dignity, hope, and the courage to change the story for those who come after us." As applause rippled across the room and the city's skyline glittered beyond the windows, Melissa realized that her greatest revenge had always been her own unstoppable flourishing, and her deepest healing was made real day after day by giving that possibility to others.